So Estancia Cristina, this is a remote 20-room lodge nestled in the heart of Los Glaciares National Park in the Argentinian Patagonia region. And it is a boat ride away from El Calafate, which I'm sure many of you will already know about. In order to understand a little bit more about the region of the Argentinian Patagonia, if you would like further training or one-on-one sessions with me, please don't hesitate to contact me about that so we can schedule a time. This will be more of an overview of the lodge itself rather than about the region. I can also then include some extra regional information on how to arrive, how best to fit a property into an itinerary, or any special requests your clients may have for one of our partners. Okay. So a little bit of background about Estancia Cristina. Estancia Cristina is essentially an original estancia farm built by a British couple called Joseph and Jessie Masters and their two children in 1914. The estancia still conserves its original essence, keeping the history of this pioneering family who through a lot of effort and perseverance turned this quite inhospitable and solitary place into something quite different. They arrived with about 12,000 sheep, 2 motorboats and 2 flatbeds to move the wool, and then 10 years later they had amassed about 20,000 hectares for their farm. They all worked in really extreme conditions to produce the wool, transporting the machinery over the lake in boats they had actually made themselves, and also creating a small radio station from which to communicate with the outside world. And they also acted as like a hostel for climbers and adventurers in the region wanting to summit the surrounding mountains and to get out on the southern ice fields. So their children, Herbert and Christina, naturally also worked on the farm with herding and building. And it's actually Christina who the estancia is named for. And this is partly because she sadly died from pneumonia at the age of 20 in 1924. So fast forward to the mid-60s, and Estancia Cristina started to hire a woman called Janet Hermingston, who came into their lives to help Jessie with her daily tasks at the estancia. She quickly adapted and fell in love with the valley, having come all the way over from the UK as well. And then some years afterwards, with Jessie and Joseph in their late 70s, and when they grew frail and passed away, she was left with Herbert, so their son, in charge of the farm. And by this time, they had cattle there instead of sheep. So at the age of 80, Herbert and Janet actually got married. They had fallen in love anyway, but this was also so that the farm could be left in her names. And 2 years after that, Herbert passed away. And then with Janet, with the agreement of the national parks, decided to use the estancia just for tourism purposes, selling all of the cattle. So the establishment of the Los Glaciares National Park in the 1930s has meant that Estancia Cristina has got this beautifully unique position deep in the boundaries of a protected area. And the owners continue to work closely with the park's officials to guarantee the protection of the surrounding flora and fauna and all the environmental regulations necessary. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about where the lodge is located. Here you can see in the slide the logo here where Estancia Cristina is on the edge of this bay. Here is El Calafate, and then about a 30-minute drive along the coast of Lake Argentina is Puerto Bandera. And then Puerto Bandera, from there is where you take the boat up to Estancia Cristina, up through one of the channels of Lake Argentina. Just to give you a bit of context of the geography as well, Perito Moreno Glacier is down here, if you can see my mouse. And this here is all of Los Glaciares National Park. This is Lake Viedma further north, and El Chalten is located just up here as well. It's about a 3-hour drive from El Calafate. So the boat trip across Lake Argentina, or rather up this arm of the lake, takes about 3 hours. And what it does along the way is makes sure that it kind of gets close to the cliff so you can see some condor nesting, but also there's these magnificent bright blue icebergs that kind of float past the boat that the guests can spot from the viewing platforms. So this is an example of the timings of the boats that guests can take from Puerto Bandera. Essentially, there are two different boats. There's one for the day tripper service and there's one for the guest service. The day tripper service leaves quite early in the morning and arrives back to El Calafate kind of late evening, around 8:30. It's a much larger boat. There's quite a lot of people on board, and guests of the lodge are welcome to take this boat because it then generally means they have more time at the lodge. However, if they'd like a more personalised and exclusive service, there is also the guest service, which is a smaller boat. It's a bit more comfortable. There's more food served on board. You have like a better guide to person ratio. And these have slightly different timings. So they leave later in the morning and arrive at the Estancia just after lunch. And then again, the return to Calafate is just after lunch, arriving to Calafate in the evening. So being in the Patagonia, in the depths of Patagonia, the weather here can change quite radically several times in a day. The winds can be really quite strong, and so there are sometimes waves on the lake. It is the largest lake in Argentina, so it has kind of got these quite large swells. And so this can occasionally make the crossing a bit rough. That's just something to bear in mind. But when you're here in the height of summer, so January, February time, the temperatures can reach, to the early 20s or kind of averaging out around 18 degrees. But what makes it really spectacular or extra spectacular is that you can get over 17 hours of daylight on any given day in the height of summer. This is their boat that they use for their guest service. It's called the Chinook, and it carries passengers across. And then the guest boat is slightly smaller than this, as I mentioned, with large comfortable chairs. So on this boat, if guests were to take the boat for the day trippers, they actually have their own designated area to sit. So it is slightly more spacious and less crowded. They're also allowed to disembark first and embark first as well. And they're met on the shore by the staff of the lodge so that they don't get kind of taken up with the crowds of the day trippers. So you can see here, the boats have these viewing platforms from where guests can see the floating icebergs on the lakes. The trip of the boat actually does go down the channel of the Uppsala Glacier a little way, so you can see the Uppsala Glacier in the distance, but they can't go very far down the channel because there's a lot of larger icebergs down the channel, and so it can prove to be a little bit dangerous. But it is the only boat trip that goes down that channel a little way. So on arrival onto the bay where Estancia Cristina is located, as I mentioned, the guests are met by the staff at the shore. And then from there, it's a short walk up to the Estancia. And the bags are taken separately by the staff in the vehicle. And then if guests are a bit unsure on their feet, they can also take this vehicle up to the lodge, where they're then checked in and shown to their rooms. The accommodation at Estancia Cristina is all one standard, and there are 4 rooms per each of these little cottages. They have this really welcoming, lovely communal area and 2 rooms off each side of that. So there are, as mentioned, 5 of these cottages, so 20 rooms in total. 3 of these cottages are kind of out in the open a little bit, like this one. With an incredible backdrop behind. And then there are 2 more cottages that are slightly more hidden in among the poplar trees and closer to the octagonal, which I'll talk about in a moment. So depending on the availability of the lodge, you can request for your clients to have a more secluded casita, or indeed you can have one with where you have friends in the same one. And they've also started a package whereby the casitas can be, or the cottages can be exclusively bought. So if you have clients who just want that very private experience, they can have a rate to have one of these cottages just for themselves. So this is the communal entrance of the cottages. As I mentioned, they're very warm and welcoming, with comfortable seating areas, and there's heating and there's books to read. And then the rooms themselves are all the same size at 32 meters squared. They're very big, they're really warm, they're very welcoming. They're not overly luxurious. They're very much in keeping with the kind of estancia feel and style. But they do have individually controlled heating and these incredibly expansive views of the mountain backdrop behind. The spacious bathrooms are equipped with hair dryers and amenities. I remember having this extremely kind of hot and strong shower in these bathrooms. I thought it was one of the best showers I'd had. And this is an example of the views you get from behind the cottages. This is the mountain range behind the estancia, and the mountain they can see framed in their windows is called Cerro Norte, which is quite a sight to wake up to. And as I mentioned, you have this really long day of sunlight, and you have the sky changes into spectacular colours that you can see from these windows as well. So other areas which are exclusively for the lodge guests only are this octagonal, where they have their restaurant and their bar, communal seating areas. They have a nice fire as well, which is generally on the go the whole time. It is the only area with Wi-Fi, which is something to bear in mind. And it's very warm and comfortable with this great well-stocked bar. There's also a lovely outdoor seating area in the garden, which is only accessible through this building, which is a really lovely place just to sit and relax with a cold beer after a full day's trekking outside in the Patagonian winds. The food at Estancia Cristina is mostly all sourced locally, and the owners actually have spent much of the last season developing their own kitchen garden without any guests. You know, they put their minds to other things, and so through this kitchen garden they're hoping to provide the hotel with all of their own fresh fruits, nuts and vegetables. Everything at the hotel generally was very fresh and delicious, particularly good kind of Patagonian fare, quite a lot of fish and meats, but also accompanied with very large healthy salads and things like that. They've got a really good selection of Argentinian and Chilean wines, as well as several of the artisan beers from the region. These have taken off particularly well in Patagonia recently, in the last few years, because of the particularly good water in the region, and also kind of the North European influences that are still retained in some of the areas. So the menu takes a form of 5 or 6 choices per course, which is the same for the entirety of a guest stay. Guests tend to stay for 2 or 3 nights at Estancia Cristina. We wouldn't ever really recommend that guests stay one night, because you really want to stay in and make the most of the area, particularly as the weather can change quite so drastically here. Lunches are occasionally a really large buffet style. This will depend on the occupancy of the hotel, and this will take the form of like large hearty stews, but also lots of really beautiful fresh salads and fresh cold meats and cheeses. And then if guests are going out for a full day trek or horse ride, then packed lunches are also available. And these take the form of kind of making your own. They supply guests with a Tupperware box and cloth bags to fill with whatever they need, to make their own sandwiches, make their own salads, and they can request whatever they want to take up with them as well. And then just above the restaurant in the top of the octagonal, this is an area for guests again to relax and just take in the views, but also where guides sit with the guests to go over their itinerary for the following days for their stay. So the activities on offer from Estancia Cristina take the form of mainly trekking, horse riding, and there are several different kind of levels of difficulty involved with these as well. One of the main reasons to stay at Estancia Cristina is to see the Uppsala Glacier. It's probably one of the only places in the whole of Los Glaciares National Park where you have this incredible panoramic view of the glacier and the southern ice field beyond. It is the largest glacier in the region, which is what makes it quite so spectacular. And Estancia Christina being so remote and only accessible by boat makes it all that much more special. So this is an example of their vehicles that take guests up to the viewpoint. And then, just as a reminder, the viewpoint excursion is only available to lodge guests, full day discovery and full day trekking. So there is another full day excursion that visitors of the area can take, but they don't incorporate this viewpoint of Uppsala Glacier. And this is the route going from Estancia Christina up to the viewpoint. So on a clear day, you can, as I mentioned, you can see all the way up to the ice field and the mountains beyond with these incredible panoramic views. You go up here with the guides. It's about a 20-minute walk from where the vehicle drops you off. It's all flat and so perfectly accessible. And the guides then leave the guests to take their time here to soak up the vistas, but also they take their time to explain the topography of the region, you know, how the glaciers are formed, but also how the glaciers have changed over the years, how much they've receded, and that kind of thing. And then for guests and people taking the full day trekking option, this is the hike that you take down from the viewpoint back to the Estancia. It's down a route called the Fossil Canyon. This is an incredibly spectacular hike, which takes in many different views of mountains, lakes, valleys, and these incredible different coloured rock formations. It is an 8-mile trek. It's mostly all downhill, over rocks and fairly slippery surfaces here and there. But it's not difficult, it's not technical. It makes the day quite long. If there are day trippers taking this route on the full day trekking, then the lodge makes sure that guests are ahead of the day trippers so that they don't come across the kind of large groups of other tourists. And they're also able to then take their time down the trail and stop their packed lunch and get back to the Estancia in time to enjoy that beer in the garden afterwards before freshening up for dinner. So this is an example of the kind of views you can expect on this walk, which are absolutely breathtaking, really at every turn. There's something different to see in a different aspect of the surrounding region. And of course, they're really very likely to come across many of the fossils that decorate the pathway and are in the cliffs and paths along the way. Ammonites are perhaps the most common fossil here, possessing the typically ribbed spiral form shell as pictured. And these were creatures that lived in the seas between 240 and 65 million years ago. And it's something which the guides also go into much more information for the guests. Along the trails, guests can also expect to spot many of the larger birds in the region, so eagles, condors. And then when we were trekking, we managed to spot a couple of puma prints. And so the guide will make sure they take their time to point these out to guests. Puma prints and whale prints are quite common on these trails. So that is probably the highlighted kind of trek that people like to take, and it is really quite spectacular. But of course, there are other trails that guests can take in the surrounding area. So this one is called the Carnero Hike, which is on the other side of the bay, as you can see here. So just to remind you, the Fossil Canyon one is over here with the viewpoint to the glacier up here, and then this one follows the bay round in the opposite direction. So as you can see here, the view is back down to the Estancia, which is down here, and this trek can actually be extended over this bluff, if I just show you here, and going back further along here and up and over the mountain to another bay where there is a hut that the family built as a kind of a storage station, and then they can be taken back to their hotel by boat. This is actually one of my photographs to show that you have these incredible views not only back to the Estancia but also across the lake and up the lake over to the mountains beyond. I thought this was one of the most spectacular panoramic views that I saw during my stay. And then there are several smaller hikes that guests can take, either with a guide or actually they can take them by themselves. This is one of those which is a very good introductory walk. So it takes just a few hours, or a couple of hours, I'd say. And it's perfect for when guests first arrive to get a feeling of the area. It's called the Walk to the Waterfall of the Dogs. So this is the kind of scenery that you see and looking back to the estancia and the lake beyond. And then this is the rushing waterfall that you arrive to, stop for refreshment, and then make your way back to the hotel. This walk can also be extended further into the hills beyond, up to what they call the Mirador Cristina. So this is a longer full-day hike, which is 9 miles. And then for this one, you definitely do need a guide. Again, with these absolutely spectacular views and scenery, going through deciduous beech tree forests, and across the glacier and the viewpoint in the distance. And this trek can also be taken on horseback. So the estancia has several different routes that guests can take on horseback in the surrounding hills and along the rivers. They have their own stables, and the horses are all looked after very well by their resident experienced gauchos. And the stables provide guests with all the necessary equipment of hard hats and chaps, as well as a safety briefing and any guidance for those who are less sure on a horse. The routes on horseback around here, as on foot, are really spectacular, and they traverse along the valley. They go along or even through the rivers and also up into the hills. Estancia Cristina is also a really popular place for people who are into fishing, or particularly fly fishing. And fishing for rainbow trout and Chinook salmon. They are only available with previous reservations. That's something that you should talk to your DMC about, or you can contact us for more information. And this isn't actually available for any full-day trips for people coming from El Calafate for the day. So the Catarina River is very wide and easy to wade, but it's extremely short. It's only 8 kilometers long from the source in Lake Anita, and then it reaches Lake Argentina. But it has these pools ideal for fishing rainbow trout. And in February, the river is a particularly good place for salmon Chinook fishing, as they come here to spawn and die. And then there's a couple of other lakes that guests can fish in, Laguna de la Pesca, which has 8 acres of surface area, and is about 5 miles from the estancia, where there's a lot of rainbow trout. And then Lake Pearson, which is a glacial lake 11 miles from the estancia, where you can find Chinook salmon and rainbow trout. Both of those lakes are only accessible by foot. So that's something to bear in mind. If you have clients that are interested in fishing, they should also be aware that they will have to hike to those lakes as well. Yeah, that's something that I just mentioned. So this is the example of the kind of fish that they're likely to catch, and it's all catch and release. So there are 3, I mentioned that there are some self-guided trails, one which I've already mentioned, which is the Waterfall of Dogs, which is the top picture here. And as you can see, the red trail. And then there are a couple of other self-guided trails that guests can take from the estancia. So if they have like a spare hour or 2, then they can happily wander out from the lodge and visit a couple of these areas. So one of them is what they call Laguna de los Patos, which is up here in the blue trail, which will take just an hour or so. And on the way you pass this historic kind of mill and the bridge that was originally built by the masters. And then there is also a trail that people can take to the edge of the lake to see the boat that the masters family built themselves, called the Cristinita. And then something which we would recommend for all guests to take is the historical tour, because this really goes into the depths of the life that the masters family lived, really, with much of their old machinery, furniture and belongings all on display and still intact. They have this newly created museum, which I think opened just a couple of seasons ago, which houses all of the artifacts with really good explanations of what they are, how they work, and how they were developed. The guide will also go through much of this with the guests as well, because they've all been, you know, studied hard on the history of the estancia. And so, as well as the kind of artifacts you find here and the machinery, they have more of the personal details about the families themselves and their personal lives and how they lived on a day-to-day basis. So here you have Herbert and Christina, who are the children of the master's family. And then the photo in the top right-hand corner is of a radio that Herbert spent many years building himself in order to communicate with the outside world, and with which he also used to communicate with people all over the world, as it turns out. So above this radio is actually a cabinet full of messages from people as far away as Japan and the US and different countries in Europe. So it's quite a fascinating display. The tour also includes a visit to the family's chapel, which is where they're all buried and where they have had their ceremonies and mass once a week. And then they also take you to see the old mill and bridges that they built and are still standing today, that were used in their farming operations and now are used for people to start or end the trails either on foot or horseback. So I've mentioned the day trippers excursions a couple of times, and just to go over what is available for people who are coming from Calafate for the day. You've got the full day classic discovery, trekking and horse riding. The trekking is the most kind of active, with taking guests up to the Uppsala viewpoint by 4x4, and then it's the trek down through the Fossil Canyon back to the hotel, back to the lodge, with a packed lunch on the way. The full day classic and discovery both include a large kind of meal in a quincho, so like a Patagonian slow-cooked lamb. The discovery goes up to the viewpoint and comes back down by 4x4, and the classic just includes a short walk to the waterfall, and they both also include the historical tour. So this is an example of where they have their lunch in our quincho, and as I mentioned, the trekking have their lunch up on the mountain. So because we are advocates of staying overnight, we have included a few different reasons why we think it would be beneficial for guests to take that extra time and stay overnight. So basically, if you are staying overnight, you can obviously start these activities earlier or finish them late. When guests are coming to Estancia Cristina and they are staying for just 2 nights, what is really great about the timings of the boat is that you've got quite a lot of time in that afternoon when you first arrive to take a short walk, and then you've also got the morning of the 3rd day to also take a half-day walk. So essentially within an itinerary, you can do 1 full day and 2 half-day treks or walks or horseback riding, or 4 half-day. So that's actually a really good amount of time, I'd say, to stay at Estancia Cristina, especially because you have these really beautiful long summer days. So the excursions, they've got, just to summarize, so we've got these 9 hiking options, 3 horse riding options, and 2 fishing excursions, plus some self-guided activities on foot. You've got the use of the Octagon restaurant, bar and lounge, which is not open at all to the day trippers. And you can obviously choose from the 2 different boat transfers each way. So the rates for the packages include all return transfers from El Calafate, food, full board, soft drinks, and the choice of daily activities, and entrance fee to the national park. If you have guests that are particularly interested in much longer hikes right up into the mountains, and this is something that Estancia Cristina can also organise, but they will need to know in advance because it will be an extra request. They will need to get extra guides in, most likely. And this is likely also to be to carry an extra fee. But if you'd like any more information about that, then please don't hesitate to contact us, and we'll put you in touch with Gabby, who represents, who works for Estancia Cristina in Argentina. So this area and its hikes, in comparison with the with the 2 other major highlights in this region, so you've got Chaltén and the Fitzroys and Torres del Paine National Park. The main overriding thing is that you're in isolation. You're the only people there. and you've got these incredible hikes that nobody else is taking. You can only get there by boat. You're surrounded by quite similar people, and you've got far fewer people on the trails. And you know, your trails are right there from the hotel. It has a similar iconic national park status, but lesser known, and so Torres del Paine is always going to be much busier. It does mean that travelers don't necessarily need to cross the border if they want to just stay in Argentina. That's an excellent place for good hiking. As I mentioned, there's less time in vehicles. It's only accessible by boat. And it's got this amazing kind of historical value to it, which you might not be able to find in other places quite so easily. And so that's it. One thing I didn't mention was the combining Estancia Cristina with El Calafate and going to Puerto Moreno, because obviously the main reason why people visit Puerto Moreno, El Calafate, is to go to Puerto Moreno. So what we do suggest is that guests or clients have a positioning night in El Calafate, either before or after a 2-night stay at Estancia Cristina. There is a very early morning flight, or there used to be, depending on how schedule is going to be for the coming season, from Buenos Aires to Calafate, and from there they can take the boat straight to Estancia Cristina. And again, if they wanted to go on to Buenos Aires, or I can't remember where it used to stop at right now, but there is a flight that goes out of El Calafate at around 7 or 8 in the evening, which is combinable with the boat from there as well. So we have all of the resources, so high-res images, fact sheets, excursion sheets, and rates in our resource center. This is a link to our webpage and a link to the Estancia Cristina page. As I mentioned, I'll be posting this presentation on the follow-up. And yeah, next week I will be presenting Puerto Valle, which is located in the northeastern part of Argentina in the Ibero wetlands. So quite a different area of Argentina. And this is just a list of the partners that we're representing at the moment, again with the links of different places. And our these icons do have links to our socials as well. So that's something that I can obviously send you in the follow-up. So thanks very much for listening, and if you have any questions, please do post them into the chat box.